Good day, everybody, and I wish you a successful conference. I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but personal circumstances make that impossible. It is a very timely conference to talk about counterterrorism because we are facing some new challenges in counterterrorism, both in terms of the actors who threaten to carry out terrorist attacks and also the tools and capabilities that they bring to the table when they try to carry out these attacks. At the same time, there are opportunities for our nations to defend ourselves, again, using technology and analytics that allow us to anticipate and respond to attacks. I speak to you literally within a day of a terrible incident in Texas at a synagogue where a terrorist took hostages in the synagogue. Fortunately, the hostages were able to escape. The terrorist was killed. His objective was to demand the release of Afia Siddiqui, who over 10 years ago was convicted of aiding and abetting terrorism by killing American soldiers in Afghanistan and by planning mass casualty attacks in the United States. Actually, she was a scientist, and among the things she talked about doing was carrying out a biological attack, which of course could have been devastating. And that reminds us that terrorism remains a live issue as we speak, even though it's now, for the United States, over 20 years since September 11th. In the neighborhood in which India exists and lives, you of course are watching very closely what's going on with Afghanistan. And the US withdrawal has put the Taliban back in charge. They are now in their own conflict with ISIS, but it suggests that in Afghanistan, there may be a platform within which future terrorist attacks can be planned and people can be trained to carry them out. And if I recall back to when we first entered Afghanistan in 2001, in response to September 11th, we found laboratories, we found training centers, and that suggests that whenever terrorists or terrorist sympathizers get control of territory, they can use that as a way of experimenting with new terror tools and training people to use those tools to devastating effect. So as we look at what's going on in South Asia, we're acutely conscious of the fact that what happens in Afghanistan may have ripple effects in India, in Europe, and in the United States from a terrorist standpoint. I should also say that we look at Iran, which is also not very far from the neighborhood, and we see the Iranians increasingly becoming belligerent in their view, in response to what they view as American hostility to their efforts to build a nuclear capability. And some of you will remember that, again, almost 10 years ago, Iranian hackers, prompted by the Iranian government, attacked and destroyed numerous computers for Saudi Aramco as a way of trying to cripple Saudi's oil production. They also attacked American banks and tried to interfere with the ability of those banks to conduct business. So we've seen nation state actors like Iran propagate terrorism by using surrogates to carry out cyber attacks. And of course, in the United States and in other parts of the world, we've lately seen the rise of domestic terrorism, where indigenous people in the United States, in New Zealand and elsewhere, have adopted extreme ideologies and have looked to carry out devastating attacks, whether it be with guns or bombs or even driving automobiles to try to run people over and kill them. And so we're now facing a domestic threat, which is particularly challenging from a domestic intelligence standpoint, because our concerns about monitoring domestic behavior run up against our desire to preserve freedom of speech and political freedom. So we don't want to overreach, but we also don't want to be wide open and vulnerable to what can be deadly attacks. Finally, as we look at who the threat actors are that we're concerned about, I've mentioned nation states. There are also global networks that get online and recruit each other and inspire each other to carry out attacks, whether that is on jihadi groups or right-wing extremist groups. And they're able to use the platforms of the internet to great effect in building up people who are sympathizers. Part of that is the technology of the algorithms that the platforms use in order to drive people to continue to spend time on the platforms. And that usually means using data to identify areas that may be of particular interest and then suggesting ever more extreme versions of content that are designed to lure people further and further into a dark place. And some of those wind up moving offline and carrying out terrorist attacks. And I should also add, this is not something that nation states have left alone. We've seen a lot of evidence of Russian disinformation and other nation states engaged in disinformation, some of which is designed to recruit and inspire violent attacks. Unfortunately for Ukraine, if you look now at what's going on in that part of the world, the Russians are using cyber tools to undermine Ukraine, to inspire or justify a potential conflict. And they've done that in the past in the region. So we face threat actors who are not just independent terrorist groups, but globalized networks and even those inspired by nation states. So let me tie this into technology, because technology has afforded both greater risk, but has also afforded some opportunities if we use it wisely. The greater risk, as I observed in the first place, of course, is the fact that cyber tools now allow for recruitment of terrorist actors or inspiring behavior that is terrorist in nature, simply by using algorithms to connect people together, to lure them into becoming recruited as extremists, and then to give them some tools and some training in how they can carry out attacks. These are not necessarily the most sophisticated attacks, but they can cause damage and death. But even beyond that, a greater concern is the fact that cyber weapons themselves can have real-world terrorist effects. Some years back, Iranian hackers thought they had hacked into a dam, a water dam, and were going to have the ability to open up the doors and let all the water flow in and flood a residential area. Fortunately for the United States, they made a mistake in what dam they were dealing with, and it turned out to be a very small facility that had no effect. But it indicated an intent to use hacking into an operating system or an industrial control system in order to cause real-world damage and death. More recently, a couple of years ago in Oldsmar, Florida, some individuals hacked into a water treatment plant and shut off and altered the purification formula so that the water actually became poisonous. Again, fortunately, that was discovered in time, but had this been successful, it would have resulted in people dying by being poisoned from their drinking water. And we've also seen a lot of evidence, both over in Europe and in the United States, that terrorist groups or criminal groups, often acting at the behest of or with the encouragement of, for example, the Russians, have penetrated into the electric grid and may have the capability, if they are ordered to do so, to shut the grid down and cut off power. So cyber is now becoming not just a matter of stealing data or information, but it is becoming a weapon that can be used to unlock devastating effects. And that's one area in which technology has become more of a problem from a terrorism standpoint. We're also concerned, obviously, about new tools like drones. You know, we've worried about protecting aviation now for over 20 years, really more like over 50 years. And now we have to be concerned that these very small drones, which can be guided by artificial intelligence, could be used to interfere with flight paths or otherwise carry out terrorist attacks by dropping explosives. So the battlefield area or the attack surface dramatically increases as you come up with drones that have a capability to travel autonomously and to carry a payload. And that's putting a premium on technologies to disrupt drone attacks and to keep drones away from areas like airfields, for example, or other sensitive critical infrastructure. And finally, I think as we look at potential technological threats, when we look at what we've lived through in this world over the last 2.5 years with the COVID flu virus, this has no doubt, again, reinforced what we always knew some terrorists were thinking about, which was a desire to cultivate biological weapons as a way of carrying out mass casualty attacks. And having seen the effect of COVID on the global economy, on the number of people who got killed, I suspect there are going to be people in some parts of the world experimenting to see how they can weaponize it and transmit it. So all of these are areas in which technology is going to actually create new tools and new threats from terrorists. But now let's turn the page and talk about where technology can help us. And the first thing is, much of what we have tried to do over the last 20 years is build the capability to anticipate who may be terrorist actors and what their plans might be. Now, back in the days when I was in government and we were dealing with Al-Qaeda, we were dealing basically with a hierarchical, highly organized group that wound up with fairly complicated plots. And what that meant was that by using our ability to intercept communications, to conduct aerial surveillance, and to actually put people into the field, we were able to collect intelligence on the plans of groups like Al-Qaeda in advance. We were able to locate and identify their principal leaders and ultimately apprehend them and bring them to justice. And so because of the complicated and fairly wide-ranging nature of what Al-Qaeda operated as, in a sense, it gave us the opportunity to separate the signal from the noise, and the signal being the signs of terrorist planning, and then to react to that. What has happened, though, more recently is terrorism has become more widely distributed. It's often not particularly organized. The communication is really often done on platforms, including encrypted platforms, or by talking publicly in a way that's not necessarily clear to anybody except those initiated. And that means the amount of data out there, or the amount of noise, has dramatically increased, and finding the signal in the noise becomes more difficult. This is where artificial intelligence and some of the capabilities we have in absorbing, digesting, and sorting large amounts of data will become increasingly important from a counterterrorism standpoint, because you can't monitor everything that occurs online in a social media platform or on Twitter or simply all over the internet, because you can't possibly analyze it as a human being. But if you have machine learning and artificial intelligence, it can be applied to large amounts of data in a way that will allow you to narrow down what human beings need to analyze and then look at them more closely. And that allows us to compensate to some extent for the fact that otherwise all of the discussion and planning and plotting would be obscured simply by the pure volume of data. Another area where artificial intelligence can become very important is in the area of money. Because one thing we've learned is if you're going to do any kind of reasonably sophisticated or complicated terrorist plot, you're going to need to finance that in some way. And tracking the money flow, as we learned after 9/11, can be an important way of identifying terrorist networks. And so again, using the fact that we can now get visibility into money moving networks around the globe, and then apply artificial intelligence and analytics and machine learning to sort through all the money data and look for suspicious patterns, that gives us the opportunity to, again, see what might be percolating among the terrorists out there. And finally, I have to say, when we come to online technology, somewhat to my surprise, many of the, at least domestic terrorists we've seen in the last several years practice very poor, what I would call operational security. In other words, they're not very good at hiding their intention. To the contrary, we often find that they are literally announcing to the world on social media that they want to kill a lot of people or that they have some terrorist objectives. And the problem is, how do we find that when we don't know where we're looking? And again, this is about having the ability to have visibility into open source information, not things that require a court order to intercept, but looking simply at open source information, and then again, using machine learning to sort through the patterns and things that might indicate what you need as a closer look. So I think the use of our cyber capabilities and our machine learning capabilities will become an important element in counteracting what I think has been a movement of technology in a way that can be helpful to terrorists. As I mentioned, we also want to worry about drones, and there are now anti-drone capabilities in the world that allow us to make it more difficult to bring drones into areas that we need to have as secure and safe for air travel or for other kinds of activities. And so I think we need to be looking to build that kind of technology. Yet another thing which is improving is the technology that we're using in airports and other public spaces to screen for explosives. We all grew up in the last 20 years with a fairly cumbersome process of checking baggage and checking human beings. We've since seen advances in both personal screening and baggage screening that make it more efficient and more accurate. And I think the next generation of these screening tools will perhaps allow us to enter a public space without stopping or taking off our shoes or doing anything that would impede our progress. And yet the capability of screening will be sufficient that we can detect if someone is carrying a gun or explosive. And so again, that's a way of allowing more accurate screening, but in a way that does not inconvenience or make it difficult for people to go about their daily lives. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think as a result of the pandemic, screening for biological threats will also get better, whether these be natural threats or some that are enhanced by terrorists. Again, it's about mapping what the characteristics are of a particular threat, contact tracing, looking to see whether there are other indications of some transmissible illness, and then reacting quickly to prevent it from spreading. And one of the difficult lessons, but maybe ultimately a useful lesson of the last 2 years is to build those capabilities up, because I think we may be seeing these again. So as we look at technology around the globe, we see that technology can be an assistant and an enabler for terrorism, but properly used, it can also be a way to protect against terrorists. And let me finally, though, leave with this very important note, which I know will resonate both with the audience in India and the audience in the US and elsewhere in Europe, where we do believe in freedom and free speech and protecting people's civil rights. When we apply intelligence collection technologies, we need to build into those technologies a process that allows us to assure people that we are obeying the rule of law, that we are respecting people's civil rights, that we're not misusing or manipulating these technologies for political purposes. Because if you sacrifice the credibility and the rule of law, you will quickly see people push back against the technology, and then you will not have the value of it. But if you respect the rule of law, if you conduct operations in counterterrorism in a way that does respect human rights and doesn't overreach, then it becomes sustainable over a long period of time. And I have to say, when I look at the state of the world, I have every reason to be concerned that we're going to be facing versions of a terrorist threat for the foreseeable future and maybe far into the future. So we want to build a robust and sustainable and respectful set of tools we can use to defend ourselves. So it's a dangerous world out there, but there are some very smart people working hard to give us the tools we need to protect our citizens and protect our nations and protect our values. And I commend you for a global effort here at this conference to look at some of these opportunities and some of these obligations, and to see how we can continue to build, working jointly as allies, a strong structure to protect our nations, our freedom, and our lives. Thank you very much.